room are on a similar list, and I'm sure you also agree that it's an honour because you've clearly done something that's angered the right people, the people you want to anger. But in travelling around the US, obviously in the company of a former member of, I may get this pronunciation wrong, but Sarah McCall, is that roughly? Okay. Obviously I felt very safe. Although sometimes I had to question that. You know, I won't go into detail. I'm sure those who are here understand what I'm saying. But there is, we all know the reputation that his former unit has in the world. We all know, of course, that the British Army is the finest army the world's ever seen. In America, when you speak in America with a British accent, they all think you're extremely intelligent. Over here, they just go like. But there are some very close connections between Sarah McCall and the British equivalent, the Special Air Service, including they stole the SAS's motto, "Who dares wins," for one thing. But another connection that you may not know, that I just want to spend a few moments just telling you about, you may or may not know it, is also a connection with your own Prime Minister. I know Israel loves, we're always being told that Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East, and you so much love democracy, you always want to have elections. But the connection is this. There was, you may or may not know that in the First World War in 1917, 1918, there was an organisation in the British Army which was called the Jewish Legion. And the Jewish Legion, I don't know how well educated you are in history of Israel and the Jewish people, but I'm about to educate you.
27,000 people.
Thank you. As a Roman Catholic, I think it's only right that I should teach you a bit about Judaism. But the Jewish Legion was a part of the British Army. It was part of a regiment called the Royal Fusiliers, and they were formed in the UK in 1917, made up of Jews from Britain, from Palestine, from Russia, from the United States of America, from other countries around the world. One of their number was even Private David Green, who later became David Ben-Gurion, who was one of their better-known members. And the first chief of staff of the IDF was also a member of the British Army in that war. And when they were formed, they marched through the streets of London on their way to come out here to Palestine to fight against the Turks. Led by the band of the Coldstream Guards, one of the most famous regiments in the British Army, playing the Hatikva, which was their regimental march. They had the Star of David on their shoulder, and they had their cap badge with a menorah with the word Kadima underneath. For those of you who don't speak Hebrew, Kadima means forward. Now, they were commanded, they fought here in Megiddo, among other places, but they were commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Patterson. Jonathan Patterson was a British Christian colonel, because of course you couldn't have a Jew commanding a British military unit at that time. Had to be a Christian. Fair enough. And after the war, he went and lived in the United States of America, where he became a close friend of Ben-Zion Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister's father. And he became so close to him that when Ben-Zion Netanyahu's first son was born, he named him after this British Christian officer, Jonathan Patterson. So he became Jonathan, I believe, or Yoni Netanyahu. And he was his godfather. The Prime Minister has a silver cup that was given to Yoni Netanyahu on whatever the Jewish equivalent is of christening. I don't know what it is. I don't want to say what it is actually. When Jonathan Patterson died, his final wish was to be buried in Palestine among the soldiers that he led in battle, who were killed in 17 and 18. But he died in 1947, and it wasn't really feasible. And so a couple of years ago, his remains were exhumed from Los Angeles, where he was buried. He was brought over here and buried in a military graveyard where members of the Jewish Legion were killed, in a ceremony presided over by the Prime Minister. So that is the connection, I think, between what a very strong and very powerful connection between Britain and the Sarah McCall, one of whose most famous commands was named after this British Lieutenant Colonel. Of course, we have many other connections. One thing I would add to that is that if it wasn't for Britain, I do not believe the state of Israel would exist today. And I'm sure I know there's a lot of varied feelings about the United Kingdom and Israel, and we've done some very, very bad things, including preventing immigration into Palestine at the very time that so many hundreds of thousands of Jews needed to escape from Europe. But one event, we all know about the Balfour Declaration, and I think that was quite instrumental in the recreation of the State of Israel in 48. But one other thing occurred, which I think was at least as important, and if it hadn't occurred, I wonder if Israel would exist today in the way it is. And that was the British military campaign in 1915 to 1918 here, in which 168,000 British and Imperial troops became casualties fighting the Turks and removing the Turks from this land. If that hadn't happened, with the Jewish Legion among them, then why would the Turks not still be in control of this land? Or at least if the Ottoman Empire had collapsed, then why would they not have, an Arab government not have succeeded it? So I think that's another important connection. We've had ups and downs between us and the Jews and the state of Israel in Britain. But today, I don't believe very many countries are closer to Israel than Britain is, even though it's not necessarily in the headlines. Certainly in terms of intelligence and defense and technology, we are among the closest countries in the world. I don't think there's any two countries that are closer in intelligence terms than Britain and Israel, with the exception of Britain and the United States and Israel and the United States. Mossad and MI6, the equivalent in the UK, which James Bond used to work for. I think it's now Jane Bond. That's one of those. But they conduct joint operations with each other, which is extremely rare. Not just joint liaison and exchange of intelligence, but joint operations, extremely rare in the intelligence world between two national intelligence services. Eyal did make me an honorary member of Mossad just now. I'm sure that's in his power. And the reason he brought it up, because I quite often say to people say to me, why are you so strong in your support of Israel as a non-Israeli, non-Jewish Brit? And the answer to that is normally because I'm in the pay of Mossad, which I do get accused of all the time. I mean, there's obviously got to be a reason. It can't be anything to do with truth or reality or genuine belief. It's got to be something to do with some kind of extortion or bribery or something like that. So, but the point I always make is that Mossad is a very, very famous, very well-known intelligence service, but it has a significant failing, and that is in its accounts department, because it never writes checks. At least if it does, I've never received them. But another connection between the UK and Israel, which is extremely important, I mentioned the intelligence connection. The number of lives that Israeli intelligence has saved in the United Kingdom. I'm talking about British soldiers' lives on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan from Israeli intelligence, as well as Israeli battlefield technology and exchange of techniques, but also British civilians' lives who have been saved. I mean, only a few weeks ago we found out about a plot that had been conducted about 3 years ago in London, where an Iranian proxy had intended to manufacture about 3 tons of explosives in London to carry out attacks. That cell was disrupted and the attacks prevented by British intelligence working on information provided to them by Mossad. And that's just one example of the many, many areas of intelligence cooperation that we see. And we're fighting the same enemy. There's no doubt about that. We are definitely fighting the same enemy, Britain and Israel. Today, in Bethlehem, the IDF prevented a stabbing attack by a Palestinian terrorist. Today in London, the British police shot dead an Islamic jihadist who already stabbed about 2 or 3 people, fortunately not fatal. These are the things that we have in common. These are the things we share. And it's not just Britain and Israel, it's every country around the world, including countries that some people would perceive as being enemies of Israel, who benefit from Israeli intelligence. Not just intelligence, but technology, battlefield technology. Counter-bomb technology has saved the lives of British troops in countries around the world. I visited a hospital in England a few years ago. I visited a young British soldier, 18 years of age, who lost 2 legs and an arm and an eye in an IED attack in Afghanistan. And he was lying there in his hospital a few days after it happened in Birmingham in London. And he knew that the reason he was alive that day was because of Israeli battlefield medical technology. He'd been administered a blood clotting agent developed in Israel that saved his life at the scene of the explosion. And that is an incredible thing, an incredible achievement for which we owe the state of Israel a huge amount. When I was working as, Eyal didn't mention it, but I can't remember your name.
Yeah.
You mentioned it. I was working for the British Prime Minister a few years ago in Downing Street on international terrorism. And I can attest to numerous occasions in which the Israelis assisted our forces, and just want to mention 2 of them, one of which was, while I was working there, I was told, you're going in a week's time to command British forces in Afghanistan, and you'll be there for 6 months. And that's, I mean, I don't know how it works in the IDF, but that is standard practice in the British Army. You get 1 week's notice to go away for 6 months to the other side of the world. And I know you don't tend to go to the other side of the world except for disaster relief, etc. But my immediate thought was I have commanded British troops facing the threat of terrorism, every kind of terrorist threat, with one exception, and that was suicide terrorism. And I didn't really know how we should handle that. So I spoke to the head of station of Mossad in London, who I worked very closely with at the time. And I said to him, can you get the defense attaché from the embassy to come and tell me how the IDF deal with suicide terrorism, because you're the leading experts, unfortunately. And he said, no, I will not do that. And I thought, oh, that's friendly. You know. I bought you many cups of coffee. I've shared many secrets I shouldn't have shared with you. They're very persuasive. And he said, I will do better than that. And he sent to the Golan Heights for a brigadier general who was commanding a division, who was deemed to be the IDF's #1 expert on suicide terrorism at the time. 2 days later, he was sitting in a hotel lobby in West London with me, telling me how the IDF dealt with suicide terrorism. I was writing it down for about 4 hours. I turned that into the British Army's policy for fighting suicide attackers. That then became the NATO policy, and therefore the policy, devised as a result of the IDF or Mossad sending back to the UK their leading expert, has saved the lives of British, American, Canadian, all manner of soldiers fighting against terrorism around the world. And the other example I just want to mention to you is, on 7th of July 2005, we had our 9/11. We had the explosive attacks, the suicide attacks on the London Underground. I was the chairman of the Cobra intelligence group. Cobra is our kind of national crisis management committee, like the White House Situation Centre and whatever your equivalent is over here. I think it was 10 to 8 in the morning these explosions occurred. I received a phone call we were all in disarray because we did not have any intelligence about this. We were not expecting what happened. I received a phone call from the head of station of Mossad in London, who said to me, with immediate effect, anything you want, any resources you want, any intelligence, any assets, anything you want, you pick the phone up and tell me, because from this moment, you, London, are the #1 priority of our intelligence agency for anything you need, which was an incredibly reassuring thing to hear from a very, very dear friend. And I don't mean the man himself, I'm talking about the country. We also got a call from the CIA as well, saying a similar thing. Is anyone French here? I'd just like to know a little bit about yourself. The French are our natural enemies. We didn't get a call from the French or indeed from the Germans. But that sort of action is something that I don't think one will ever forget. And it certainly has led me to, and among many, many other reasons and many other things, it has led me to become a staunch supporter of Israel. And I just want to say a few words before I sit down and shut up. And you will already gathered that I am very, very fond of my own voice. But I promise you I will shut up in a minute, because I'm getting some evil looks from AL now. But I just want to mention why I believe this organisation, Israeliz, is so important. I've spent a lot of time over the last few years, since 2008, effectively going around the world and speaking against the lies and the disinformation, the distortion, the propaganda, the slur campaign against Israel, which I consider to be the greatest slur campaign in the history of the world. And I've encountered a great deal, and I know this is not news to you, I've encountered a great deal of hatred and opposition for your country. And I've done my best, as best as I possibly can, to try and counter that in the United Nations, in universities, in high schools, in government buildings around the world. And one of the greatest hotbeds of anti-Israel hatred is the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. I've spoken there about 5 times. And in fact, only I think it was 2 years ago, or a year ago, I went and spoke at Geneva in relation to, they just conducted an investigation, so-called, into the violence on the Gaza border, the so-called peaceful protests that have been occurring there over the last couple of years. And I literally went from here, from the front line. I was allowed by the IDF to go into the sniper positions, to the observer positions where the commanders were on the front line with Gaza, and was then able to go directly from here to Geneva and make a speech at the United Nations Human Rights Council, telling them the reality that countered their allegations that Israelis were deliberately killing and deliberately shooting innocent civilians on the border. I knew differently. I'd watched it myself. That none of them in that room had been near the place and didn't know anything about it, including the ones that conducted the investigation. There were no military experts involved. I've commanded British troops facing similar situations, facing violent rioters with terrorists behind them, using them as human shields for the same purposes occurred and is still occurring on the Gaza border, albeit the situation was a little bit different, but it's very similar in many ways. And when I stood there, when I watched what was happening, I could not come up, as a soldier with 30 years experience, I could not come up with an alternative solution to the solution the IDF were using. And every time somebody spoke to me about it, and every military expert or every so-called human rights expert said to me, well, the IDF, they're doing it completely wrongly. And many people have said this to me. I always say to them, well, please tell me, what would you have done? How would you do it? And there is not one answer comes out of them. And that's true of so much of this anti-Israel hatred around the world. There is nothing but contempt, there's nothing but anti-Israel feeling among many of these people, yet they don't really understand what it is they're talking about. While I've been at the United Nations, I've spent days at the United Nations, and I've been to speak to the ambassadors there, and I've said to them, well, in your speech against Israel, you said this. What did you actually mean? What do you understand? And they didn't have any understanding, no understanding at all what they're talking about. All they know is the lines they've been told to read out and spew forth in the United Nations Human Rights Council. And then at the end of the day, they get into their big black Mercedes and drive off to their huge residence, being paid vast amounts of money by the taxpayer for spewing out the hate. After I made the speech I mentioned about Gaza in the UN Human Rights Council, immediately afterwards, the Palestinian Authority ambassador there, stood up and he said, that man said what he said because he was paid $50,000 by the Zionist entity. I pointed out I wouldn't get out of bed for $50,000. But so I do believe that it's this battle that we're fighting is so important. Before I finish, I just want to say when I was in Afghanistan in 2003, I think it was now, a few years back, before most of you were born. I attended an Afghan Independence Day ceremony at their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and all of the commanders and diplomats from international organisations were present. And the American ambassador made a speech, and he said Afghanistan and the United States of America share many, many things. One of the things we share is securing independence from the United Kingdom. And I know that Israel also celebrates the independence you secured from the United Kingdom, and most countries around the world do, because we once were an amazing imperial power that controlled the vast majority of the surface of the earth. And we shouldn't be proud of that, I know. But we've joined you now. 3 days ago we joined you. We celebrated our independence.
Brexit.